was when I went hitchhiking as a teenager that I first read the New Testament. In the back. On that occasion, the driver who picked me up was a Christian, and we got talking. He said if I wanted to find out about God, I should read the Gospels. I wasn't travelling through the Egyptian desert at the time. I was actually on my way down to Exeter, hitching along the A303. But it was a turning point. And when I got home, I read the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I think really it was John that struck a chord with me, with its deep sense of Christian mystery, and its poetry, and its mysticism. That day was the first step on a journey that led to my ordination as a priest in the Church of England. But what I didn't know then was that these Gospels were only a fraction of the information we have about Jesus. In fact, over the last century, discoveries here in the Egyptian deserts have revealed that in the first 400 years after Jesus' death, there were in existence more than 20 Gospels, 15 apocalypses, and nearly 50 other texts about Jesus. So why do we only know of the ones in the New Testament? This is the story of a battle of words that spread across continents, that led to intrigue, forgery, condemnation. A battle in which texts fought against each other for acceptance in a fledgling faith. And what was at stake was the kind of faith that Christianity would turn out to be. If the Gospel of Peter had won out, Christians today might believe that Jesus never died. If the Gospel of Philip had won, Mary Magdalene might have been hailed as the first pope. If the infancy narrative of James had been accepted, I would have learned in Sunday school that a child called Jesus caused his teacher to wither on the spot just for reprimanding him in class. In fact, if any of the different texts had ended up in the New Testament, Christianity today would look very different, or perhaps it wouldn't have survived at all. The New Testament, 4 Gospels, letters by the Apostles Paul, Peter and James, and the book of Revelation. It's a collection of texts that our society has taken utterly for granted as the books that form the basis of Christianity. Certainly this apparently perfectly ordered set of texts are those I've had to absorb. I've had to study since becoming a priest in the Church of England. But throughout all my theological training and all the conversations I've had with other priests and Christian academics, we've never really discussed, I never really knew about the countless other books that didn't make it into the New Testament. This film is the story of my journey to uncover this treasure trove of lost literature, and through it, the very different forms of Christianity it represents. What I've discovered through them is a religion far removed from the sanguine, organized movement I believed it to be. These lost Gospels were discarded by the early church fathers as heretical, and they were left out of the New Testament. But I've come to believe that without them, we can't begin to understand the origins of the Christian church. These texts have reawakened in me a new fascination in Christianity and shown me what an extraordinary place the early church must have been. My journey begins in Egypt. The metropolis of Alexandria was home to Athanasius, one of the most powerful and colourful Christian bishops in history, who lived and worked in the city in the 4th century AD. Described by one contemporary as a man whose face was radiant with intelligence, he wrote every year to all the Christians under his jurisdiction to tell them when to celebrate Easter. But in his 39th letter, written in 367 AD, he had something more controversial to say. What Athanasius included in his letter was a list, but not just any list. He named the 27 books which we now know make up the canon of New Testament scripture. And he made it clear, he made it very clear, that it was these and only these that the church approved of as scripture. Any other book, he said, should not be read. At a single stroke, he condemned a wealth of literature that had, up until that point, been regarded as Christian. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John were permitted, but those of Mary, Philip and Peter were condemned. The Acts of the Apostles was considered to be educational, but the Acts of Thecla were shunned. The first and second letters of Paul to the Corinthians were allowed, but I'm afraid the third one didn't make it. Athanasius' edict was remarkable because it was the first time anyone in the top echelons of the church hierarchy had suggested that only certain books would be tolerated. And for nearly 2,000 years, those texts that the bishop banned remained a complete mystery to us. Really, all we had was scant references to them, found in the writings of their enemies, the early church fathers, who only mentioned them purely to condemn them and to warn his congregation of the erroneous teachings they contained. And perhaps this might have remained the case if it wasn't for a chance find in December 1945, a discovery that forced scholars to completely rethink the nature of early Christianity. "300 miles south of Cairo, close to the Nile, is an area called Nagamadi. It's an extraordinary place, made more so by what was found buried here just over 60 years ago. A library of papyri books containing more than 50 individual works from early Christianity, the majority previously unknown. I've come here with Professor Bart Ehrman, who's devoted the last 30 years to studying this period of history.
Well, this is where they discovered the manuscripts. There were 7 farmhands from the nearby village of Al-Qasar who were out digging for sabak, which is a nitrate-rich soil in this area that they use for fertilizer. The 7 of them were digging near one of these boulders, and one of them hit something in the ground and uncovered it, and it turned out it was a skeleton. Next to the skeleton, they found a jar, an earthenware jar, reddish color, that stood about 2 feet high.
What was in it?
And the jar was, they didn't know at first because the jar was sealed, in fact. There was a bowl over the top, and they were afraid to open the jar because they thought there might be an evil genie inside. And then after some reflection, they realized there might be gold inside, and so they smashed into it with their mattocks, and there wasn't gold or genie. There were some codices, some books.
The books form the most significant collection of lost Christian writings. The manuscripts date from the 4th century, but some scholars believe they may have been composed much earlier. They include several Gospels about Jesus. But the man they describe is unrecognizable from the Jesus found in the traditional books of the New Testament.